Okay, so this second video on Macbeth, we're going to look at some more contextual information on Macbeth. This is at the back on page 101, so it's right at the end of the play. You can see that there. And this is extracts from Chronicles of Scotland, which was Holinshed's book in 1577 about the history of Scotland. This is extracts from the Chronicles of Scotland, which you are welcome to read through. This is the story of Macbeth. So this is what they believed happened, and this is what Shakespeare has based it on. So it's based on a true, if you like, historical account of what happened with someone from Macbeth. But Shakespeare has changed things, and we looked at that in our first video as to what he's changed. There's quite a lot of detail here. I'm not going to read this through with you. You're welcome to kind of read it. You don't really get marks for mentioning Holinshed's Chronicles in the exam or mentioning how they're similar or different, but it might be useful to see. It's based on a kind of true story. There's also songs for the witch. This is a realised element. Again, we're not going to look through that. You don't need to know about that. But the thing we are going to look at is this, which is background information. I know you've done some work on the background information so far. We're looking at England in 1606, which is when Shakespeare was writing Macbeth. So we've got, for instance, a time when people still believed the sun went around the earth. They were taught this was the way God had ordered things, and that in England God had founded a church and appointed a monarchy, so the land and the people could be well governed. Basically, you've got a time when people were told things by elements of religion and by kind of kings and priests and churches, church at the time, to keep them in control. This is nicely broken up into lots of subheadings to help you kind of understand, and we're going to look at the background, and we're going to look at a bit about Shakespeare and a bit about kind of Scotland in the time the play was set. So it's written in 1606 and set in the 11th century, so we're talking about the 1000s there. For most of Shakespeare's life, Elizabeth I was monarch, and when she died she was succeeded by James I, who was also King of Scotland, and the two kingdoms were united in 1603 after Elizabeth's death. So Scotland and England start to form the basis of the modern day United Kingdom. With his council as ministers, James governed the nation from London, although not more than 500,000 people out of a total population of 6 million lived in the capital city. Law and order were maintained by the landowners and enforced by their deputies. So, your local kind of councils, if you like, Barnsley Council, Sheffield Council, would have had a lot more power back then to enforce things because the king would have stayed in London. It was a period of high inflation when political and social unease resulted in constant threats to the king and the establishment. So it wasn't a happy and settled time, and when poverty was widespread as well. And it's not really mentioned in Macbeth at all. The old man is the only character who mentions this, but think about the effect of Macbeth's actions on the average man in Scotland. We don't really consider it too much. It's something you do at A-level or university with Macbeth. But this idea that if you've got people just seizing the throne for their own ambition and power, it's not going to be a pretty successful time. At the time, England was a Christian country. All children were baptised soon after they were born into the Church of England. They were taught the essentials of the Christian faith and instructed in their duty to God in mankind and humankind there. Marriages and funerals were conducted by the licensed clergy and according to the church. Attending service was compulsory. Absences without a good medical could be punished by fines. In this way, authorities were able to keep some control over the population, recording births, marriages and deaths, and being alert to anyone who refused to accept standard religious practices. So they used religion as a means of controlling people in society. Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, had broken away from the Church of Rome, Roman Catholic Church, and from that time all people in England were able to hear the church services in their own language rather than in Latin, so they started to move things to the Church of England. Book of Prayer was used in every church, and an English translation of the Bible was read in public. The Christian religion had never been so well taught before, and Shakespeare uses a lot of biblical reference in Macbeth and the plays. School education reinforced the church's teaching. Boys could attend the petty school to learn reading and writing. At the age of 7, a boy was ready for the grammar school. Grammar schools taught Latin grammar, translation work and the study of Roman authors, paying attention as much to style as content. The art of fine writing was important from early youth. A very few students went on to university. These were either clever boys who won scholarships or else the sons of rich noblemen. We're talking about Penistone being founded in 1392 as a school, so this would have been one of the schools where people went on to university, but education wasn't really available to the masses. It was kind of a select few there, if you like, and girls stayed at home and learned domestic and social skills. The lucky ones could read and write. It's quite interesting when we think about the roles a woman should play, and how Lady Macbeth subverts those gender roles, so goes against them. That's quite an interesting point there. Language, I'm not going to read through the language. It's this kind of conflict between Latin and the other various languages that had taken over kind of England. The great art form of the Elizabethan and Jacobean age. So Jacobean refers to King James. So if you want to say like the King James era, that would be Jacobean, because it's drama. Elizabethans inherited a tradition of play acting from the Middle Ages, and they reinforced this by reading and translating Roman playwrights. Plays performed by a group of actors. Obviously, we know women weren't allowed to be actors at the time. And touring companies continued outside London. There was, in London in 1750s, a new building was erected for the performance of plays. This was the theatre, and then other playhouses followed, including in the Globe, where most of Shakespeare's plays were performed, which has been rebuilt today, and is certainly well worth a visit. But basically, drama became popular. People started going to the theatre more. People did disapprove. They encouraged the spread of disease and dangerous ideas. Playhouses were closed when the plague was at its worst. Censorship was imposed. This idea, if you were going to speak out against the king or against certain groups, that was a big problem. You've got the theatre as well, hexagonal theatre. You've got kind of galleries. You'd have the groundlings, the people who pay, a penny to go and stand in this area here, and obviously they're subject to all the kind of the weather coming in. You can still do that in Shakespeare's Globe. You can often pay £5 to go and see some of his plays. And then you've got the kind of the lords and ladies in these galleries here above around there, who pay a little bit more as well. Over the stage was a thatched roof supported on two pillars forming a canopy, which seems to have been painted with the sun, the moon, the stars for the heavens. So it's a very early theatre, but it's interesting that even the poorest members of Shakespeare's society would go to the Globe Theatre to watch his plays rather than go and get drunk or gamble or kind of watch animal fighting in the kind of streets in London around the Globe at the time. They kept everything backstage, and obviously there's a replica built in Southwark on the Bankside of the original. So we're going to look at Scotland and Macbeth in this second video. Scotland in the 11th century. This is when the play was set. So it's written in 1606 and it's set in the 11th century. It's an exciting place of life or to live, as the country was in a state of constant change, but it was a treacherous place too. Warring families and clans battled to control land and trade. So basically, if you wanted to take power, provided you were strong enough, you would do. So there's no kind of one ruler. People were led by thanes, whose castle became an important power base. Murder was committed frequently, particularly for political reasons, so to gain power or for kind of revenge, because revenge killings were quite common. The government was primitive and consisted of the king and his immediate council, which included both warlords and church leaders. These men would agree on policy and try to put it into practice, but communication movement were made difficult by the combination of lochs and mountains, moors and bogs, and the scenery in Scotland. Basically, it's a time of power, war, people just seizing control as well, which means that living there at that time, you could perhaps understand Macbeth's behaviour in the context of 11th century Scotland. Nowadays we've got much more sophisticated systems of government. We've got the Houses of Parliament, we've got the Queen, and obviously, it's unlikely that somebody would just kill the Queen for political gain. It's a lot harder to do, but this was commonplace in 11th century Scotland. The real Macbeth was born in around 1005 into a powerful family that ruled the Scottish lands of Moray and Ross. It was a violent time and battles for power were commonplace, and we've mentioned that even within families and clans as well. Macbeth's own father was murdered by his cousins. Macbeth was in a strong position for the crown. He was descended from Malcolm II, Macbeth's grandfather, and married Gruach, granddaughter to a High King of Scotland. He became Mormaer, Great Steward of Moray, a position of almost royal authority. So perhaps the reason that Macbeth suspects that suspects that he was destined for greatness is because actually the Macbeth in Holinshed's Chronicles, the real Macbeth, would have been in a position. Duncan was king of the part of Scotland that's the modern Strathclyde. It's said that Macbeth resented Duncan's position, this is the real Macbeth, as grandson of Malcolm II. Macbeth was expected to become king through rules of tanistry, which is mentioned here, and that Duncan's rule was regarded as ineffectual and unpopular. There are hints in the novel that Duncan is not an effective leader. He's a good man, but he makes poor choices. One of those is giving Macbeth the title of Thane of Cawdor. And this idea that obviously the real Macbeth didn't like Duncan. At the start of the novel, the play character Macbeth does like Duncan. But Macbeth took Duncan's throne by force, so that did take place, and was elected High King of Scotland in around 1040. So it's based on real events. Succession to the royal throne followed the law of primogeniture, where property and position are passed down from father to eldest son. Scotland did not adopt this system until the 12th century and the reign of Malcolm, who succeeded Macbeth to the throne. Scottish kings ascended to the throne according to the system of tanistry. Tanistry is where the throne is passed not through the father but through the mother. So this is quite an interesting point, because Malcolm is given the title from Duncan, and of course primogeniture dictates that actually that would go to the eldest son. So if something happens to the Queen, for instance, in our country, Prince Charles will take over the throne, and then Prince William as well if anything happens to Prince Charles. But Tanistry ascended to the throne, so this meant that the heir, called the Tanist, might be the son of the reigning king's sister instead of the eldest son of the king himself. So perhaps we can start to understand why Macbeth might have had a bit more of a belief that he would succeed to the throne in the play. Began to abandon the system of tanistry during the reigns of Duncan, though. So, they started to think about this and get rid of this, because obviously you need that kind of stability. It's quite an unusual way of doing things there. Macbeth and Malcolm II. So during that rule, they started to get rid of it. In Shakespeare's Macbeth, Duncan introduced a new system for succession by announcing that Malcolm is to be his heir. Malcolm uses primogeniture, this idea of passing to the eldest son, in a way it's kind of halfway between. He's moving to a new way of doing things. So that might perhaps explain a little bit more detail why Macbeth is so angry that he kind of isn't given the title. Scotland in 1606. So Queen Elizabeth of England died in 1603. James, if you like, was King of Scotland and then became James I of England. He proved himself a successful monarch and hoped the succession to the English throne would bring England and Scotland closer together, which is quite a noble aim. Unfortunately, his succession, known as the Union of Crowns, was unpopular with many Scots, who considered it disastrous to have two parliaments, the English and the Scottish, ruled by a single sovereign. The English were not happy either. They didn't like the idea of England being under the rule of a Scottish king. And you only have to look at the moment of things like Scottish devolution, the Scottish referendum, that this is something nearly 400 years later, people are still getting quite angry about, and rightly so, and people have quite a strong sense of national pride. In 1606, when Macbeth was first performed, things were not easy for James. During his first few years on the English throne, James had been faced with a variety of challenges, including the ongoing argument between Puritans and Catholics in Scotland and the Gunpowder Plot in England. This discontent later led to the abandonment of his plans for a union of Great Britain, an idea that proved unpopular on all sides, but obviously has since happened because we are now part of the United Kingdom. So the fact that, for instance, Shakespeare has Macbeth killed, this kind of man who's trying to seize power, could be seen as him reinforcing James's rule, because what he's trying to there is that these people are trying to assassinate James, these people are trying to argue against his rule, you are going to fail like Macbeth fails. So there's lots of kind of interesting themes going on there as well. Finally, you've got a little bit of information about Shakespeare's life. You've got a lot of kind of his references to tragic plays. You've got kind of the background to his life and kind of family. There's not really a lot in his personal life that comes across in his plays. If you compare it with Frankenstein, for instance, you can make direct links between Mary Shelley, her father's relationship, the relationship with her mother. But for Shakespeare, it's more, this is one of Shakespeare's kind of historical tragedies, if that makes sense. He blends history in the fact that Macbeth was a real story with elements of tragedy as well. Shakespeare continues to write serious drama from 1603 and tragedies, and obviously retired from the theatre and wrote kind of comedies as well. So it's just a bit of information for you about Shakespeare's life, and then kind of going on to the back couple of pages, you've got a kind of a list, dates of his kind of works as well. There are some things here for teachers, some kind of questions that you might want to look at as well, some ideas. We don't tend to use them in class, but you're welcome to have a look through them there. But that's lots of contextual information about Macbeth. This might be quite useful as you're reading through the play, just to think about how Shakespeare uses things going on in his life at the time. Just make sure you've got that highlighted and you've made some notes on that as well. And in the next one of these, we are going to be looking at the key quotations from parts of Act 1.